In part 1, we explored what geopolitics and especially its imperialist branches are and what terminology it deploys. In part 2, we reviewed Russia's big plan and the motivations behind it. In part 3, we examined Russia's plans for conquering West Europe. Now we are looking at the direction Dugin sees as the most distant future direction in Eurasia, the south. As this is the most distant priority, the plans here are not as detailed or even coherent as in other directions, but they still portray a clear window to the imperialist thinking in Russia. In the southern regions of the Eurasian continent, Dugin expects to be able to find a much more fertile ground for his anti-US message than in Western Europe. The ultimate goal that Russia's actions should be oriented here are reaching and militarily controlling the coastal warm sea that would grant Russia an uninterrupted all-year-round access to world oceans, which Dugin sees as a critical towards challenging USA's sea power in the long term. With these naval bases, Russia would be able to continue its conquest beyond Eurasia, especially towards exploiting the African resource base and also denying US any bridgehead on the Eurasian continent. But there are problems that Russia needs to navigate here. One is the set of big countries that are annoyingly existing in the regions that rightfully belong to Russia. Another is the geopolitically active player, Turkey, who has the audacity to dare to seek extending its influence wider than a well-behaved regional power should have any right to in a Russian-controlled world. And just to be clear right from the start, as was the case in the West Europe, Dugin is not expecting Russia to tolerate any long-lasting coexistence with anyone. Ultimately, all will be assimilated. In the south of all Eurasia, Russia must establish a new geopolitical order based on the principle of continental integration. Therefore, all the existing political formations of the south, the Islamic countries, India, China, Indochina, should obviously be regarded as a theater of continental positional maneuvers, whose ultimate task is to strategically tightly connect all these intermediate regions with the Eurasian center and Moscow. On this basis, the entire coast of Eurasian continent from Anatolia to Korea should be considered as a potential Russian south. Dugin understands that the anti-American sentiments which he hopes to exploit are not the only ideological topic of importance in the South. USA has indeed burned many big bridges by previous actions and is causing a constant friction with their fundamentally different value base. But many of the same problems apply also to Russia, as they too have earned a questionable reputation with past actions like attacking Afghanistan, and they too are fixated to organizing the world according to a different spiritual and cultural value base as the ones that are prevailing in the South. In general, the entire Islamic zone is a naturally friendly geopolitical reality in relation to the Eurasian Empire, since the Islamic tradition, more politicized and modernized than most other Eurasian denominations, is well aware of the spiritual incompatibility of Americanism and religion. The Atlantists themselves sees the Islamic world as a whole as their potential adversary, and therefore the Eurasian Empire has in his person loyal potential allies, striving for a common goal, undermining and, in the long term, the complete cessation of American Western domination of the planet. It is difficult to imagine how these Islamic regions, with an awakening national self-consciousness, can again join Russia bloodlessly and painlessly. At the moment, Islamic world is extremely fragmented, and within it there are various ideological and political trends as well as opposing geopolitical projects. Lacking better and more creative ideas, Dugin reverts back to the same plan as in Western Europe, where Russia has also earned a challenged reputation, i.e. needing to deploy a facade to promote Russia's agenda. Once again, Dugin proposes to select one exclusive partner in imperialism to do its bidding and waste its resources so that Russia would have easier time later on to mop up and claim the spoils. Here he argues that Moscow should pick Iran as its chosen workhorse. He dismisses other major ally candidates such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia on the basis that they are too closely allied with the USA, and India on the basis that it is not showing imperialist proactiveness and instead favors Iran, who is organically very anti-American. It is immediately clear that the purely Atlantist poles in the Islamic world, whether they are secular, as in the case of Turkey, or Islamic, and the case of Saudi Arabia, cannot fulfill the function of the southern pole of Eurasia in the global project of the continental empire. Remains Iranian fundamentalism and pan-Arabism, left wing. From the point of view of geopolitical constants, Iran, of course, has a priority in this matter, since it satisfies all Eurasian parameters. It is a major continental power closely connected with the Central Asia, radically anti-American, traditionalist, and emphasizing at the same time a social political vector. It is clear that among the non-Moscow trends, the new empire can rely only on the pro-Iranian orientation, which will bring this region out of direct and indirect control of the Atlantists. The first order of business for Iran is that Dugin would like it to decomplicate the Islamic world and make it more easily conquerable for Russians. He proposes that Iran should integrate the southern component. It would be ideal to have an integrated Islamic world as the southern component of the entire Eurasian empire, stretching from Central Asia to West Africa, religiously united and politically stable, basing its policy on the principle of loyalty to tradition and spirit. Creation of a Central Asian empire which on a federal basis could integrate various peoples, cultures and ethnic groups into a single southern geopolitical bloc, thereby creating a strategically homogeneous but ethnically and culturally diverse Islamic formation, inextricably linked with the interests of the whole Eurasian empire. And once again, translating Duginisms to English, this strategically homogeneous means, of course, kill everyone who opposes. Furthermore, he proposes that Iran should do what Russia just is not capable enough to do by itself: conquer Afghanistan and Pakistan. It is important to note that the pro-Iranian large base potentially includes Afghanistan and Pakistan. You know that Pakistan, with GDP comparable with Iran's, but with over twice the population, occupying a territory that favors the defender and armed with nukes. That Pakistan. For reference, let's remind ourselves how effortlessly it has been for Russia to annex a country that has only 1/4 of its population and 1/10 of its GDP, and which is located in an easily accessible geography and having no strategic weapons. And then there's this Afghanistan, which has kicked out imperialist superpower after superpower, century after century. Dugin doesn't seem to be really believing, even himself, that Islam could be united under one interpretation. Nonetheless, he writes that he feels Iranians most likely want to hear. Russia could support Iran's efforts to convince others that it is the Shias who have understood Islam correctly, and Sunnis should just realize their foolish misunderstandings and restore their religious traditions under the guidance of the holders of the true faith. The eastern countries of the Near Abroad have only one positive way to create a new greater space. This is the path of the Islamic Revolution with the focus on Tehran. At the same time, national conflicts can be resolved and the religious tradition and the religious system restored. Even Dugin realizes that there is this thing between Shias and Sunnis that might be insurmountable. and which might require tolerating additional sub-empires' existence, as long as they are fully compliant and towards Russia's ultimate goals. Given that the model of a purely Iranian fundamentalism is unlikely to become universally accepted in the Arab world in many respects due to the specifics of the Shiite Aryan version of the Iranian Islam, the Pan-Arab project should strive to create an independent anti-Atlantic bloc with Iraq and Libya as southern poles and liberated Palestine, under certain conditions also Syria, i.e. those Arab countries that are more aware of the American danger and more radical than others reject the market capitalist models imposed by the West. So ultimately, Dugin does not care about Islam. He just wants some ideology, any ideology that is hostile to US. And remember, ultimately, it is the Russian Orthodox who have the final word in earthly history. With centuries-old ideological dilemmas done and dusted, Dugin cannot but wait to flip out the imperialists' most favorite playbook once more. If it will work in West Europe, it will work here as well. Dugin sees that it should split the intermediary and especially the Turkey-oriented countries between itself and Iran. First, Russia wants to lay claim to the most valuable and easily conquerable regions and leave the tougher nuts like Afghanistan and Pakistan for Iran to deal with. A peaceful transition to the direct Moscow jurisdiction of all territories of Central Asia, especially Kazakhstan, compactly populated by Russians. But the most important question is that what should be done to the areas where Russia's geopolitical adversary, Turkey, is enjoying support. Yerevan automatically becomes the most important strategic link, additionally linking Russia with Iran and cutting off Turkey from inland spaces. With a possible reorientation of Baku from Ankara to Tehran in the General Moscow project, Tehran will quickly resolve the Karabakh issue as all four parties will be vitally interested in the immediate establishment of stability in such an important strategic region. We'll come back to look at the plans for mainland Turkey in just a moment. Ultimately, though, as in the West, all political units of lesser importance are to be assimilated. New geopolitical order in the Caucasus implies a rejection of the traditional approach to existing political entities as nation-states, that is, strictly fixed administrative entities with permanent borders and a complete power structure. Israel is not even mentioned in the book, literally. I searched word for word and came up empty. It was only indirectly hinted at when speaking of liberated Palestine and planning to team up with a country whose national mission includes the destruction of Israel. How can a book ignore discussing the country whose destruction your would-be ally has taken to be its national mission? How delusional do you need to be to completely overlook an armed to the teeth economic and technological and nuclear power that's proven to be more than capable of holding its own despite being surrounded by existentially hostile nations? And to top it off, if things would start to look bad for Israel, they are culturally and strategically tied with the largest military power ever known in the history of the planet. Or Dugin is refraining to discuss Israel for other reasons. One could be that there is a large Russian immigrant population in Israel, so advocating things that damage Israel would be contradicting their narrative that Russia should act as a defender of Russian and pro-Russian peoples. Maybe Dugin is considering Israel to be so deep into geopolitical arch-enemy's pockets that it demands and justifies any and all actions against them without even needing to spell it out loud. Controlling Islamic world is seen to provide a stepping stone to finalize the unavoidable necessity of absorbing all of Africa into the world island's empire. Naturally, Dugin does not expect Iran to be bothered with this triviality, but instead graciously offers Russia to take the lead on this. The integration of Pan-Arab project with the common Eurasian empire should be entrusted to purely European forces, returning to the project of the Euro-Africa, which from a purely geopolitical point of view is not two continents, but one. The European empire, which is vitally interested in penetrating the south of the African continent as deeply as possible, must in the future fully control, relying on the Pan-Arab bloc, Africa right up to the Sahara, and in the future try to strategically infiltrate the entire African continent. And continuing into parallel theme with West Europe, Dugin singles out harmful nations, which are collaborating closely with the Atlantist arch-enemy, USA, to which harm should be done. The scapegoat will be, first of all, Saudi Arabia, too rooted in Atlantic geopolitics to voluntarily enter the Pan-Arab bloc friendly to Eurasia. With regard to Egypt, Algeria and Morocco, the situation is somewhat different, since the ruling pro-Atlantic forces in these states do not express national trends, do not completely control the situation, and rely only on American bayonets and American money. When the Pan-Arab Liberation War begins at a fairly intense level, all these regimes will fall in 1 hour. The sweet irony here is that Dugin realizes that if a regime is artificially kept in power by foreign imperialist bayonets and money against its national trends, these regimes tend to have a tendency to fall apart at an amazing pace. I have not noticed Dugin's public commentaries so far on what's his take on the developments in Syria. As the ultimate geopolitical sin, far graver than a simple collaboration with USA, Dugin sees some countries' aspiration to reach beyond what is acceptable for a well-behaving, domesticated regional power, and instead pursuing geopolitical strategies that rival Russia's interests. For these sins, it is not sufficient to simply topple these countries' governments or annex them. These countries need to be made to cease to exist as a cultural entity and as a nation. These nations and their inhabitants need to be ethnically cleansed. If the Eurasian alliance should be based on mutual interest, i.e., be the result of a conscious and voluntary union based on the realization of a common geopolitical mission, in the case of China, we are talking about force-based positional geopolitical pressure, about provoking territorial disintegration, fragmentation, and political and administrative redistribution of the state. The same approach applies to Turkey. China and Turkey are potentially geopolitical opponents. Turkey is in all respects a direct geopolitical opponent to Russia. China will have to be treated as a geopolitical adversary with all the ensuing consequences. In the case of opponents, one should strive to do harm. As the reader should have learned to expect by now, Dugin is not proposing that Russia should spend its resources or get its hands dirty when dealing with Turkey. Instead, he proposes that Iran should take care of it, because conquering Pakistan, Iraq, Israel and such won't keep them busy for long. The pan-Turkic expansion, as well as the financial and political invasion of the Saudis, will be abruptly interrupted. Iran, traditionally hostile to both Turkey and Saudi Arabia, will fulfill this function much better than the Russians. Dugin proposes to first start by flaming up all pre-existing tensions for separatism inside Turkey, with Kurds and Armenians. The need to impose the role of scapegoat in Turkey in this project, since the interests of the state in the Caucasus and the Central Asia will not be taken into account at all. Moreover, support for Kurdish separatism in Turkey itself, as well as the autonomous demands of Turkish Armenians in order to wrest peoples ethnically close to Iran from under secular Atlantist control, should probably be emphasized. Then, once Iran has manage to finish crushing Turkey, Russia is happy to swing by and take control of some of the regions previously held by Turks. Iran, which controls Central Asia, including Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the remains of Turkey, or Turkey after pro-Iranian revolution, together with Russia. Finally, if there's still something left for Turkey, Dugin's last and most fever-dreamed aspiration would be that Turkey would spend its remaining strength against Russia's and Iran's remaining opponents in the Islamic world, Iraq, Saudis, Syria, thus paving the way for further conquests of the countries that just have destroyed it. To compensate for Turkey, one should offer either southward development into the Arab world through Baghdad, Damascus, and Riyadh, or provoke pro-Iranian fundamentalists in Turkey itself to radically measure the geopolitical course and to enter Central Asian bloc under the anti-Atlantic and Eurasian sign in the long run. How Dugin sees this offering of southward development to be pitched or to be accepted by Turkey is not elaborated. Still, Dugin is so happy to have come up with this magnificent idea of deploying the remaining forces of the conquered countries against later state enemies that we will be seeing a mirror image of this when we review the plans for China in the next part. As we have learned in the previous parts, Dugin sees that Russia's ultimate long-term goal is to win thalassocratic US of A. This, he sees, necessitates control over all Eurasian coasts and a year-round access to oceans. This aspiration he refers to as the need to access warm seas, and he spends much ink in elaborating its urgency. Dugin sees that the direct military conquest towards the oceans are unlikely to succeed, but an intermediate solution would be needed, and allies would need to be tolerated temporarily. Instead of seeking to conquer the coasts, Dugin places higher importance to gaining faster the ability to leverage the coasts for further expansions. By including Iran as the south pole of the empire, Russia would instantly achieve the strategic goal to which it went in the wrong ways for several centuries: access to the warm seas. The creation of the Moscow-Tehran axis at once dissects the anaconda in the most vulnerable place and opens up unlimited prospects for Russia to acquire more and more bridgeheads inside and outside Eurasia. This is the most significant point. But in no time at all, Dugin is back to its old ways and looking up for ways to secure full and sovereign control of the coasts to Russia, using brute force. With respect to the south, the geographical axis of history has only one imperative: geopolitical expansion up to the shores of Indian Ocean. From a geopolitical point of view, the entire space separating Russian territory from the southern coastline of the Eurasia is a strip whose area must be reduced to zero. In the south and west, we are talking about actively offensive geopolitics, about expansion, a totally offensive strategy. Eurasia will only be free from sea power when the oceans will become its strategic borders in the north, east, and south and west, as in the case of America. Only then will the duel of civilizations proceed on an equal footing. With this obsessive and existentially strategic fixation towards warm sea military harbors, the fall of the Syrian regime must be more painful for Russia than many realize. The inconvenient reality check against Dugin's plans is that Eurasia's south coasts are far from being uninhabited. These regions are some of the most favorable places on the planet for human habitation, and thus there are many people on the way who might not welcome Russians showing up and presenting themselves as their new overlords. Most notable example of these established cultures inhabiting the southern coasts that rightfully belong to the geographical axis of history is India. At first, Dugin begins by speaking dismissively, but politely about India. He sees that India does not possess expansionist aspirations that Russia could leverage and make India do Russia's bidding in conquering other nations. Instead, he sees India as a passive pawn that Russia can use as an outpost. Indian civilization is not prone to geopolitical dynamics or territorial expansion. India can serve as a strategic outpost of Eurasia, and on this her mission is actually exhausted. Need for maximum rapprochement with India, which is our natural geopolitical ally in Asia in terms of both racial, political and strategic parameters, seems to be absolutely unconditional. But Dugin cannot restrain himself for long, and is back to planning how Russia should move on from the intermediate state of coexisting with others. Heartland to actively participate in solving the most important geopolitical problems that converge just in this area, the Pakistan-Indian wars, the potential Uyghur Islamic separatism in China, the national liberation struggle in Tibet, and the Sikh movement in somewhat more southern Punjab, etc. This entire complex area, India-Pakistan region, should be restructured under the most active influence of the geographical axis of history, of Russia, on the basis of the tellurocratic model, i.e. contrary to the plans of the thalassocratic Atlantic elements have in this regard. The plans towards Eurasian South are incoherent and unrealistic, even by Dugin's standards. Even more, no matter how Machiavellian your thinking is, no one can genuinely believe that the end justifies the means, if the means include intentionally initiating nuclear war and killing billions of people. Right? And yet, here we are. A significant political author who has resonance with the ruling elite of the country with the most nuclear power in the world is taunting its leaders to carpe the diem. In the political sense, the anti-Americanism of the fundamentalist Iran and the strict neutrality of India provide serious grounds for the success of Eurasian strategy. The rest depends on the geopolitical will of Moscow and more broadly, Russia-Eurasia. At no point of the book did Dugin show any interest in the prosperity or well-being of the empire he envisioned. He just wants an empire, controlled by Russians, devoid of American presence. If billions need to die and parts of that empire need to be reduced to a pile of nuclear rubble, he just might be okay with that. So, for the people still arguing that Russia does not need to be adamantly opposed when it has demonstrated its expansionist aspiration in just one country, I would like to remind what can happen if you build your nation's policy on weak foundations. Even though individual level morality has little to no place in international politics, some parallels and lessons can be generalized from the level of individuals to the level of nations. This famous quote comes from Martin Niemöller, an early supporter of National Socialist regime who clearly had not thought it through well enough. They came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time there was no one left to speak up. Mr. Niemöller could have avoided this mistake by applying the acid test for his moral code that has in the history been invented several times by several moral philosophers and religious authorities. Only follow policies that one would be willing to accept no matter what your position in the matter would be. If you found the ride so far interesting, make sure to tune into the next section where we'll be encountering the global geopolitical opponent Dugin is most terrified of, China, and what he proposes Russia should do about it. We will further have a quick look what he advocates as actions towards USA and assess if we can find any parallels from the real-life events that would match this 1997 published book's thesis. We will also cover how Dugin sees Russia's internal, non-imperialistic power holders should be handled and subject those data points for validation against real-life events that have taken place since the book's publication. Finally, we'll be summarizing the game plan to gather the Russian Empire on a global level before moving on to the next section.